ต้อนรับน้องทามนะคะหรือว่าคุณนิรุตติจารุไพศาลกิจเชิญน้องทามค่ะสวัสดีค่ะคือวันนี้เป็นโอกาสดีที่พี่โอ๊ตอยากจะให้น้องทามแนะนำตัวเองก่อนเพราะหลายๆท่านอยากรู้จักชัดๆเลย
ได้เลยครับผมชื่อทามนะครับชื่อจริงชื่อนิรุตติจารุไพศาลกิจเป็นนักดีเบตสมัยมัธยมของโรงเรียนสาธิตปทุมวันหลังจากนั้นก็ไปเรียนเมืองนอกมาเลยไม่ได้อยู่กับประเทศไทยเท่าไหร่แล้วก็กลับมาครับใช่
แต่ก็คือมีโอกาสได้มาเป็นผู้เขาเรียกเป็นผู้จัดการทีมแต่ก็คือโคชชิ่งไปด้วยเทรนไปด้วย
ใช่ครับคือเราไม่ได้มีเส้นตายตัวระหว่างแบบผู้จัดการกับโค้ชท่านอื่นจริงๆเรามีโค้ชอีก3ท่านที่ถือว่าเป็นโค้ชทีมชาติแต่ตัวผมเองเนี่ยเวลาเราสมัครเราก็จะใช้ชื่อว่าเป็นผู้จัดการทีมเพราะว่าคนอื่นก็เก่งกว่าเราคนอื่นเป็นโค้ชก็เก่งกว่าเราก็ปล่อยเขาโค้ชไปเราก็มาบริหารเรื่องจัดทริปเรื่อง make sure ว่าทุกอย่างมันสมูทมากกว่าครับใช่
น้องทามค่ะปกติแล้วอย่างถามอย่างนี้ดีกว่าถ้าเราแข่งขันโต้ทีในประเทศกติกาจะต่างกับระดับโลกไหมมากน้อยแค่ไหนคะ
ต้องใช้คำว่าฟอร์แมตที่เราใช้ในประเทศไทยเนี่ยจะมี2ฟอร์แมตคือ Asian Parliamentary กับ World School ซึ่งตัวแข่งระดับโลกเนี่ยที่เป็นตัวโอลิมปิกของการโต้วาทีเนี่ยจะเรียกว่า World School จะเป็นตัวที่เป็นพูด8นาทีเทียบกับพูด7นาทีที่เราจะใช้กันในประเทศเป็นหลัก
ค่ะแต่ถ้าเป็น World เรียกว่าเป็น World Competition ที่เคนยาซึ่งน้องทางบอกเราทุกครั้งที่มาว่าเดี๋ยวกลางปีหน้าไปแล้วนะที่เคนยาใช่ไหมคะ
ใช่ครับ
อย่างนั้นได้เป็น regulation แตกต่างจากบ้านเราหรือว่าในประเทศยังไงบ้างคะ
ต้องใช้คำว่าโดยส่วนใหญ่เราจะหาไม่ได้ในประเทศไทยจะมีแค่การแข่งขันตัวเดียวคือ Thailand World School Debating Championship ซึ่งอันนั้นคือเราใช้กฎของอันนั้นเพื่อมาเป็นการคัดเลือกนักเรียนเองด้วยครับ
วันนี้เราจะมาจำลองหนึ่งในท็อปิกซึ่งแต่ละวันมันก็จะมีการหมุนเวียนสับเปลี่ยนกันไป แต่ก็ยังคงในเรื่องของ sustainability อยู่ดีเนาะวันนี้เป็นเรื่องอะไรนั้นนะคะแล้วกติกาของเราก็อย่างที่น้องทามได้เรียนแจ้งไปแล้วแต่กติกาของเราวันนี้เรามีทั้งหมด3ท่านต่อทีมนะ
ถูกต้องครับ
เพราะนั้นแต่ละท่านจะมีเวลาสปีชกี่นาทีนะคะ
ท่านละ8นาทีครับ
8นาทีก็คือหมายถึงว่าคนละ8นาที
ใช่ครับสลับกันระหว่างฝ่ายเสนอกับฝ่ายค้าน
แล้วกระซิบมาบอกว่าวันนี้ทุกคนเป็นอะไรนะคะ
อ๋อมีทีมที่เป็นทีมหลักของโรงเรียนเตรียมอุดมครับเป็นทีมเต็ง
ก็คือเขาเป็นทีมชาติหรืออย่างนี้เขาเป็นว่าที่
เป็นว่าที่ครับคือทุกคนที่เรามาของ SX เนี่ยทุกวันเลยเนี่ยครับจะเป็นตรวจว่าที่
ครับแต่ก็คืออายุไม่ถึง20เพราะเป็นมัธยมปลาย
ใช่ครับ
ก็ถือว่าเก่งแล้วนะคะน้องๆคนไหนนะคะที่มากับคุณพ่อคุณแม่แล้วก็กำลังเยี่ยมชมงานอยู่พี่โอ๊ตอยากจะขอเชิญทุกๆครอบครัวทุกๆท่านเลยหรือว่าผู้ใหญ่ด้วยหรือว่าเรียกว่าเจเนอเรชันใหม่ๆเดี๋ยวเรามาดูความสามารถกันเนาะก่อนอื่นค่ะพี่โอ๊ตขออนุญาตแนะนำฝ่ายเสนอก่อนวันนี้เรามี3ท่านด้วยกันนะคะต้อนรับฝ่ายเสนอท่านแรกตบปรบมือให้กับน้องนูมิตภูไรรัตน์แพมด้วยนะคะเชิญค่ะผู้เสนอท่านแรกเชิญขึ้นมาเลยท่านที่2ต้อนรับน้องสาริสาพึ่งรักวันนี้มีผู้หญิงด้วยนะและฝ่ายเสนอท่านสุดท้ายต้อนรับภัทรพลลิมสิริโสพลค่ะมีดอกไม้มาด้วยเหรอต้องมีผูกไมตรีกันก่อนไหมมาฟังตัวตึงของดิฉันต้องพูดว่าเป็นคนโปรดดิฉันด้วยเพราะว่า
คือเป็น FC แล้ว
ใช่ถูกต้องขาดเขาไม่ได้เลยทีมนี้ฝ่ายค้านนะคะไปเป็นฝ่ายเสนอไม่ได้แล้วนะ
เราผัดกันครับเพราะวันแรกเขาเป็นฝ่ายค้านวัน2เป็นฝ่ายเสนอกลับมาเป็นฝ่ายค้านบ้าง
มาต้อนรับฝ่ายค้านท่านแรกสกลพัฒน์เอี่ยมเสมอค่ะและท่านที่2ฝ่ายค้านของเราต้อนรับเพชรกิจชเอกชัยเหมือนประกาศมวยเลยเนาะและฝ่ายค้านท่านสุดท้ายนะคะต้อนรับภาเกตนิมมานเหมินค่ะมีผู้หญิงเท่ากันเลยวันนี้นะคะคุณได้คุณตาตั้งแต่วันแรกแล้วเนาะและที่สำคัญค่ะปรบมือให้กับน้องทามอีกครั้งหนึ่งผู้จัดการทีมค่ะคุณนิรุตติจารุไพศาลกิจเชิญที่โพเดียมเลยค่ะน้องทาม
สวัสดีอีกรอบนะครับผมขออินโทรเพิ่มจากตะกี้นี้อีกนิดนึงแล้วกันนะครับว่า Thailand National Debate Team ของเราเนี่ยรวบรวมและคัดเลือกนักเรียนมาจากโรงเรียนมัธยมทั้ง รัฐบาลเอกชนและนานาชาติอย่างวันนี้นะครับเราก็ได้นักเรียนมาจากโรงเรียนเตรียมอุดมที่เป็นฝ่ายค้านและ Anglo Singapore International School กับ International Community School เอามาเป็นฝ่ายเสนอครับทุกปีนะครับเราจะมีการแข่ง World School Debating Championship รายการใหญ่ประจำปีซึ่งเทียบได้กับเป็นโอลิมปิกของวงการโต้สารวาทีภาษาอังกฤษโดยปี 2025 ที่ผ่านมาเนี่ยเราได้เกียรติไปแข่งที่พานามาและปี 2026 เราจะไปที่เคนยาครับวันนี้น้องๆจะมาจำลองการโต้สารวาทีหรือที่เรียกว่า exhibition debate ในหัวข้อ this house would เดี๋ยวนะครับ this house would make volunteering compulsory ครับก่อนอื่นผมขออธิบายกฎเพิ่มอีกสักนิดหนึ่งนะครับตะกี้เราพูดไปแล้วว่าน้องแต่ละคนจะมีเวลา8นาทีในการพูด speech ใช่ไหมครับระหว่างที่ผู้พูดอยู่เนี่ยฝ่ายตรงข้ามสามารถแทรกเพื่อถามคำถามได้โดยการแทรกเนี่ยจะทำโดยการลุกขึ้นยืนแล้วพูดคำว่า point ผู้พูดจะมีสิทธิ์รับหรือไม่รับก็ได้แล้วแต่ดุลพินิจของผู้พูดนะครับแต่เราก็จะเชียร์ให้รับเพราะว่าไม่งั้นจะเสียคะแนนนะครับเพื่อไม่ให้เป็นการเสียเวลาขอเสียงตบมือให้กับน้องๆทั้ง6ท่านเลยครับ Without further ado I would like to invite our Prime Minister to open today's debate here
Around the world, we see persistent gaps in addressing social issues, whether it be poverty, care, education, or climate change. But why do these problems still persist? A big part of this is because there's a shortage of people willing to dedicate the time to fulfill these roles and gaps. Human beings are not naturally selfish. We are born with empathy. For example, a 3-year-old child who knows nothing about politics or economics will instinctively run to help and console someone when they sense sadness or even sometimes cry with them. This shows that we have innate empathy and the willing to help. But however, we grow up in societies that gaslight us out of empathy. We are told to compete for survival, that life is a zero-sum game, and that you have to climb over others to succeed. But these are not natural truths. They are constructs that are perpetuated by politicians and institutions to thrive on division and competition, and the result is that society leaves us with vast problems that are under-addressed.
Point.
Moving on to setup, firstly, we define volunteering as a selfless act of sacrificing your time without monetary incentives. Our policy includes for compulsory volunteering is to require, for example, a minimum amount of hours we expect citizens to fulfill, whether to access milestones like graduation, being able to get certain professional licenses, or access certain subsidies and benefits. But we say that this policy is flexible because people can choose the causes that fit their skill set and availability when they volunteer. And also institutions like schools, employers, or governments can facilitate this integration so it's not an undue burden on people. And we think that everyone can contribute, including the marginalized, for example, even the poor and disabled. More on this later though. Just to clarify, this is not coercion. We are not forcing people to adopt an alien morality because this policy is supposed to reinforce the empathy that already exists within us as humans.
Point.
Sure.
How much volunteering are you going to make people do?
We think that it depends on, for example, the capacity and also the skill set that you are able to contribute. For example, if you have more time, if you make more money, we may make it mandatory for you to spend more time or to like meet a minimum amount of requirements, but it also depends on, for example, what milestone you want to achieve. For example, it depends on different institutions. If you want to graduate, maybe the school has different requirements for this volunteering. We don't think we need to tell you an exact detail of our policy. But moving on then to our burden in this debate, First, we are going to prove why mandatory volunteering is justified and why it is necessary. First argument then on why citizens have the principal obligation to repay society. Firstly, on social contract. There is an implicit agreement that in exchange for benefits of living in a society, for example, safety, infrastructure, or education, each citizen accepts certain duties in return. We all benefit from roads we drive on, schools we attend,
Point.
and hospitals we go to. We don't appear out of nowhere. But secondly, though, citizens already accept that they must contribute financially through, for example, taxes to keep these systems running. You don't get to opt out because you personally dislike paying taxes. In parallel to taxes, volunteering is how we repay society with for example, your time. Both are equally as important because one, financial means and provisions is able to sustain financial infrastructure, but then on the other hand, volunteering is able to sustain the personnel needed to carry out these tasks. Time matters because money can, for example, buy hospital equipment, but it cannot push around wheelchairs, or this money can't be able to comfort a child. A minority of individuals cannot carry the weight of social service. But while compulsory volunteerism is able to distribute these responsibilities across everyone, we force people to serve jury duty because justice is too important to leave to a small group of people. We have national service requirements like ROTC and we require men to serve time because it is accepted by society that collective security requires collective responsibility. That's why these, what OP might frame as infringement on autonomy is justified in these cases. Taxes, jury duty, or compulsory service, all of which are justified because it benefits society and it outweighs these small intrusions. Second argument then on why we reduce social inequality. First, social issues are under-addressed because of human shortages. Schools in rural areas lack mentors, and there's always understaffing when we have response to disasters like hurricanes or floods. Voluntary participation can't fill these gaps because volunteering is irregular, inconsistent, and it's also concentrated among the smallest group of people or a minority group of people. But secondly, many people don't volunteer, not because they don't care, but because they were never exposed or incentivized to make that first step or take that initiative. But when participation is voluntary on our side, only the already aware or privileged is able to step up. But compulsion requires everyone to be exposed, right? And it forces people to see problems that they might otherwise ignore. For example, a student tutoring low-income community may no longer think of poverty as an abstract issue. Sure.
You told us earlier in your speech that you let people choose what they volunteer on, so how is it that they're going to get new perspectives?
What we mean by being able to choose what they volunteer on is, for example, if you have certain skills that you know that are good, and they're able to maximize that opportunity by helping people, we say you should do it. You should choose a cause you're passionate about, and this will allow people to actually care about the thing they're helping and actually get real change. But secondly, once people engage with volunteering shifts from a charitable hobby of a few to a civic duty for all, like for example, recycling and voting. But even if people begin reluctantly or they don't put in the effort in the first place, many people probably will continue after they fulfill this mandatory volunteering because there is intrinsic fulfillment to volunteering. You feel that gratitude, the catharsis that comes from volunteering, and you realize that it's a good thing and you want to continue. And today, marginalized communities like the poor, disabled, or elderly are primarily framed as recipients of charity. This framing creates stigma because poor people are seen as dependent and incapable of giving back. Communities are framed as passive beneficiaries of others' goodwill, but by having this mandatory volunteerism, it dismantles this stigma because everyone must contribute and roles are tailored to your capacity. For example, even if you're poor, you can still supervise playgrounds or tutor a neighbor's child, or this disabled can contribute remotely. And when society sees that everyone contributes to something, the stigma of dependency evaporates. The impact is twofold. Firstly, we have more hands on deck to fill these social gaps, but it also erodes class divides because service is no longer the rich helping the poor, but everyone helps each other. Never been prouder to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open opposition's case. Here.
The reality is the biggest problem we have right now was not a lack of labor force or volunteers, but a lack of necessary funding to implement policies that matter to the people on the ground. This includes building hospitals or building infrastructure that matters to people, and it also can include hiring people who have the expertise and have the ability for them to give it their all. Because no matter how much people you have, you cannot get good public health infrastructure or get food on the table for the most vulnerable that exists. There's two implications from this. One, that there's a problem and solution mismatch under proposition world they're unable to solve. That means that they're unable to get the most of the impact that they want to claim in this debate then. I'll get to three response and then I'm going for two substantive. First, on why the social contract is illegitimate insofar that it is arbitrary, and second, why in practical you get less benefit for the most vulnerable on proposition then. Three response. One, I think Prop claim that people have innate empathy that exists. I think this contradicts
Points
their
of
case
information.
insofar that if that is true, I think there's no need for it to be mandatory in the first place because exposure exists and awareness already exists in the vast majority of cases. Second, I think let's flip that case because realistically, they want to claim that if you are forced to do something that you hate, you'll learn and grow love out of it. I think it's unclear why psychologically you are able to get back from that hate when you are forced to do something that is difficult and that you're unwilling to do it in the first place. So I don't think the mechanism and the proof here is clear of why you will go innate empathy that exists in the first place. Lastly then, I think money then can get things done better because when you hire professionals and efficient people, you get more incentive to do good work
Point of
because you'll get
information.
fired if you do otherwise. Before I go on to my argument, yes.
So do you justify mandating taxes and jury duty?
That exists in a vastly different obligation because I think the impact that exists is vastly different and I'll prove in practical also why we still get better fundings and the most help. I think first argument then on why the illegitimate and social contracts is illegitimate as a principal obligation of a proposition then. I have three reasons here. One, I think at no point did you ever objectively and actively consent into being born into a state or obliged under a government that already exists. There's no implicit consent that is ever forwarded, and there's no actual idea of consent that exists. For example, if I'm drowning and then there's a boat and then you give me a contract of I have to pay 1,000 baht to get on the boat, I think that's still an illegitimate consent that exists because it's unclear why that is the informed choice that you are able to make then. Second layer under this is that staying in a state still doesn't mean consent into the social contracts for three reasons. One, I think migration are insanely restricted in the vast majority of cases. But second, it's also that there's merely any unoccupied land you're able to exist and live freely under and opt out of the social contract anywhere that exists. But lastly, it's also the idea of choosing between the lesser evil doesn't mean you consent into the worst evil. If I give you the choice of torture and death, I think even if I choose torture, it does not mean that I'm fully informed and that I actively consent into being tortured at the end of the day, right? The third reason under this is that voting and democratic institution still doesn't indicate consent because most people don't vote, and even if we vote for sometimes for the losing parties, and even if so, it's still the same thing that we choose the lesser of evil that exists. Second argument then on why in practical you get less benefit for the most vulnerable. There's three layers under this. The first thing and I'm going to claim under this is that on proposition, you get less overall funding for two reasons and in two ways. One, people see that they already sacrifice their time and their time is money for them, that they already use their time to help others. That is when they're less incentivized to do things like donation or donate to charity that exists because they are less intuitively incentivized to do so, even if they want to claim that innate empathy exists because they already done their work and their obligation as a citizen. So I think it's unclear why state institutions will cherish. But second all, the second thing under this is that there's also going to be less funding allocation by state institutions because the perception is that change already exists and that there's illusion of change because there's active people who is helping. This means that there's less political capital willing to be used in those areas because people demand less help because they are in general, the average person demand less help for the less fortunate because they already see the help that they've already done for society. Meaning overall, there's less funding for things like infrastructure and the necessary welfare that is prerequisite to things like social mobility. The second reason under this is that they lower the overall efficiency of the workforce because a flood of unwilling and resentful and untrained people is simply counterproductive. This looks like there's more administrative costs to manage people or oversee people doing work, or this looks like the quality of services that decline in her volunteering. When there's apathetic teaching, the kids and the people you are volunteering doesn't get the true meaning and the true crux of what you're trying to teach, or when you do careless environmental work, that is when the impact doesn't actually manifest into the world and is actually counterproductive to the entire movement that already exists. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
When volunteers are exposed to these social issues firsthand, they're more likely to empathize and donate even more and also contribute to even more to help that cause.
I still think it's very unclear why you are able to prove that doing the thing you hate over and over again, you'll learn to love it, because that choice already exists under our world when it's not mandatory. You have the active choice to do so, and if you love, especially those who are the most privileged of society, that they spend their very precious time doing volunteering rather than they work and they donate that money that they get from work to charity then. The third reason under the second argument is that there's devaluation of actual workers that is already active in the status quo, right? This means that the active worker themselves are less incentivized to put in good work or good effort insofar that they are being devalued and that they are seen as invaluable because everyone else also do the same things, even without a good intention or a good heart. Meaning I think there's less people that are going to get there all. But the last weighing I'm going to make is that even if they prove that they get overall net benefit, I don't think limiting people's agency and liberty is a worth it trade-off. This assumes that the only thing that matters in the world is consequences, and I think we disagree for two reasons. One, it's unclear why we can sum up the people's different lived experience of the world, because it's unclear what's the utility of me debating right now, or like you watching this debate right now. Like nothing can ever be summed up objectively, and there's no coherent social organism that experience all these things and can be summed up. Meaning, I think what exists is for people to choose themselves, and the liberty that exists cannot be traded off. But second of all then, even if consequences matter, the underpinning premise is that the things that give utility is human agency in the first place, and human agency and dignity is not something that we can sum up, because it's like the metaphysical reality of the world that exists, meaning when you violate these things, it's unclear why the trade-off is necessary or is worth it, because there's no objective trade-off that can be evaluated in the first place. I think for all of these reasons, opposition.
I thank the leader of opposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate here.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. People are rivers of empathy, but the very same society that opposition opposes build dams of selfishness. Compulsory volunteering on our side of the house breaks these dams. It let compassion flow back into the ecosystem. It makes people do good. We're so proud to propose. Few things I'll be doing in my speech. I will be pointing out their strategically flawed response to our POI, then talk about two issues. Firstly, on coercion, and secondly, on the meaning of volunteering, then onto this extension to Kate's second argument on why do we get more political accountability on our side of the house. First, let's talk about the POI that I gave to Ao in this debate. Ao has been met with a really simple POI. Do you justify mandating taxes and jury duty? In response, we got an indirect way of saying yes coming from opposition side of the house. This is really damning to their case panel because they would concede to the very fundamental principle that the state restricts and limits your freedom all the time. The states can enact policies beyond your consent financially and time-wise, like implementing things like progressive taxing and requiring you to do things like jury duty. And if that is the case here, why can't we create one policy that is based on morality as a framework? We think that morality is even more acceptable than any more money they want to talk on their side of the house. And therefore, we think that this policy is completely justified. Let's talk about the two issues in this round. And I want to break this debate down into two smaller parts, right? Firstly, on coercion, and secondly, on the meaning of volunteering itself so it's easier to assess. Firstly, let's talk about coercion. And I want to make it really clear here that we think that the coercion will exist on both sides of the house anyways. So when we are to evaluate about this clash, the basis of evaluating it is more so on about the coercion on which side of the house is relatively better and creates more benefit to the society. We think that it is under our side of the house, and we will prove to you so. Kate told you in her first speech that the society is incredibly coercive in the sense that it makes you believe into different narratives, right? That you have to compete in order to survive when it was never the case. Historically, if we were to look back into the prehistoric age, for example, the only way civilizations were able to be built was upon people coordinating with each other, right? People helping each other. We think that resources were never something you had to compete for. You can always help with each other. You can always lend a hand to each other, right? We think that the idea that you have to compete in order to survive on opposition side of the world is simply a construct. In response, opposition told you that this policy infringes on your fundamental right and is not a part of the social contract without mechanizing anything in between. Panel, we don't think that this is the case, right? Because Kate already told you that it is already within your best interest to do good in the very first place. But even if that is the case, why is the coercion on our side of the house better? We think that there are two reasons for this. Firstly, at the very least, the policy is explicit. You know the requirements. I mean, sure, you might not know the requirements, but at the very least, there is a clear framework that you can rely on. Comparatively then, on your side of the house, you have invisible narratives that you are not even aware about, shaping your perceptions, shaping your perspectives of the world. We think that it's just way worse off on their side of the house. But secondly then, the coercion that exists on our side of the house is one that make people do good things. It makes them donate to charities. It makes them go out of their way to help someone on the ground who might be suffering, for example. And we think that this engages with the majority of their case in this debate. Before moving on to my second issue on meaning, sure.
We have compulsory military service. Does that mean everyone likes the military and war?
I mean, sure, if you think the military is bad and people are still able to bear it, we think that this policy is just fine on our side of the house. On to this clash about meaning. I don't even understand why this is a point coming from opposition side of the house in the very first place. Because if you think about it, the moment they choose to engage about social inequality, the moment they choose to engage about wealth disparity in this debate, then they are talking about volunteering in terms of the benefit it creates instead of the intention behind it. Meaning that we think that if we were to talk about volunteering on the basis of the benefits that it creates, we clearly win on our side of the house because we now think that people are legally required to go out and help other people. But even if that is not the case, we think that meaning still exists under our side of the house for two reasons. Firstly, there is a natural incentive for you to do good with the very same incentive that a kid who's 3 years old, for example, who might not know about the harsh realities of the world, still feel for someone who is sad, still feel for someone who is facing negative emotions, still empathize for those individuals, right? But secondly then, even if you do not want to help people, and that is a fact, we think that when you volunteer for many, many times, when you're legally required it, and when it is done to a point where it is considered as a norm, we think that it will be something that you start to gain meaning with. Onto this extension, onto Kate's second argument, which is unengaged by their side of the house, by the way, on why do we get more political accountability. We argue to you that the problem in the world isn't just about poverty, isn't just about inequality. It isn't just about kids in Somalia starving because they are malnourished and do not receive the right amount of nutrients, right? We think that it is the fact that people are politically unaware and trapped in bubbles where they don't see these systemic issues firsthand, right? So for example, as much as you donate to like hospitals, to the education system and whatsoever, you don't actually understand where your money is going to, insofar that you do not step out of your own bubble, go out of your own way to help other people. We think that under our side of the house, this is really, really, really important, because now that you actually experience the issues firsthand, now that you actually see why people on the ground are actually suffering, you're likely going to empathize with them more. And this is likely going to result in you donating more amounts of money, or at the very least, volunteering your time to help those people on the ground who may not have the same amount of opportunities as you. And this is where things are incredibly important under our side of the house. Because if it is indeed true that people do not have the capacity to donate that much money, this is exactly where you will resort to calling out the government instead, right? The very same politicians who created the narrative that you have to compete in order to survive. This is really, really important under our side of the house in a few ways. Firstly, you get more political transparency. And principally, this is a really, really important thing, because in democratic institutions, it is really important that people do understand different things and you actually have complete information when you make different decisions. But secondly then, there is just now more incentive for the government to go down on the ground and help other people, right? You're likely going to push for even more welfare policies in order to help the poor. And more importantly then, we think that this means that they have an incentive to implement this policy forever, because if they do not implement these policies, it's really likely that the people will likely vote for the competing parties instead. And this will likely mean that the people get a better world. People will now be more concerned about different issues around the world. People will now likely try to do things like recycling instead, which is more considerate of the environment. People will now likely go out of their way to help people, to help children in the impoverished areas who do not have access to education, for example. We think that these are all the benefits that exist on our side of the house and cannot exist insofar that you do not legally require people to volunteer in the very first place. On our side of the house, we have more solidarity, we have a more united community, and for all of these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue opposition's case. Here.
Government's whole case rests upon one very shaky assumption. They assume that at the point that you do volunteering work, it means that you're going to change every single perception about you, that your lived experience for over years upon years with narrative from hundreds of people around you have already been shaped. They assume that when I do volunteering work, I would look down more like sympathetically to other people, and I would think that volunteer is something that I'll probably do, and somehow the capitalistic narrative is going to be gone. Panel, let's gut check this, because at the point where people still have to work for survival, where people still have like the promotion is a thing that's going to unlock them from like to be able to be freed from the poverty line, these incentives still exist for the majority of the population. Most people simply doesn't work because of they think there's a narrative tell them to do so, but it's the object reality that we live in that tells us to work, that tells us to be capitalistic, that tells us to go over other people. At the point where these things still exist and your own survival rests upon these narratives, we say that this mindset is going to stay. But also on this point, we say that it's going to be worse. Why? Because they say that people do have some point of empathy. have more empathy, and we do agree. But people will probably have an illusion that they are already doing enough. They're doing what the state already told them. It's probably going to be enough. And other people, i.e. your bosses, are probably gonna tell you that, look, you already did your share for the community. Now you have to like also do for the community or whatever. This is the same thing that happened to women when we gave them the right to maternity leave. We say that people, when they see other people already gonna like do other things, the capitalist incentive do have a purpose incentive to oppress you even more. And let's move on to like some key issues and debate then. Firstly, just on the idea or the opposite or a proposition that people are very, very empathetical in the status quo, and the only thing unlocking them is this harmful narrative. We say that it's exactly the fact that people are capitalistic, that we see them already doing things like volunteering, even in the status quo. We say there's already enough people trying to do volunteering, and there's probably a lot of like resources going into it anyways. We look and we see incentives such as university admissions, encouraging people to do volunteering. We look at government giving tax breaks to people who donate a lot, and we see that many rich people and people with like professionalism, in professional areas, already have an incentive. But if they go to volunteer and do a good thing, they can publish it, get good PR, and they can probably move up on the social ladder. And we say that when these things are probably judged on the merit of people or like professionals also in the field, this is probably going to be that the research and the things that are being done are probably going to be beneficial, even the status quo. But the real problem and why there are still problems in like structural issues in society, we tell you, is a problem of state misallocation of resources, of a state neglecting poorer people and neglecting to tax rich people correctly and spending them on the right places. We say that to fix that is probably going to be better and to mobilize the masses to do whatever they choose. But this is also very, very harmful on their side, because on their side, literally they told you that basically we let people choose based on how free they are, what their professional area is. The problem is, why is it that I would choose to volunteer in a place that's going to be very far-flung, that's going to be filled with minority, filled with people who I don't resonate with, who is not from the same community as I am? We say that for these reasons, and also for the reason I told you before, or like my first speaker told you about the illusion of change, there will probably be less amount of resources and volunteers going into areas that need it most. These looks like areas with not a lot of population density of living with minority groups of people in the mountains. And we say that these are the people who need the resources in the most, and in the status quo, there's already been job done, and on their side, they're trying to erode it. Second issue then, on just the principle justification of it all, because we already told you in first speaker that the social contract theory is flawed. To have a state in itself is oppressive, and to have it have more power is even more oppressive. Yes, we believe that the state should not exist, but it exists in the status quo, and we say that because it exists and it's bad, we shouldn't give it more power. This is like giving a bully more power to bully you even further. This is simply not something we should do. But Pesh told you that there are things that limit our agency right now, like jury duty or multiple conscription. We say this is different. Why? Because one, I think in the point of the jury duty, you have to do it for the sake of collective self-defense, which is something that comes as precedence. Why? Because when I live in a state, even if we assume on their side that the social contract theory exists, the point of the state is to be there and you concede some agency to the state for you to get back later by things like you being protected from other people killing you or you being feared to be killed, so you have more agency to live your life freely. That is why we say that jury duty exists for self-defense. Same thing as you having to go through military conscription, because we say that there's probably going to be less agency on you when your country gets attacked eventually, because you have no deterrence. So we say that if it's like self-defense, we say the state has a legitimate reason to limit your agency. But simply volunteering isn't. Volunteering is not somewhat self-defense, but also they might try to argue that you already pay taxes. The point of taxing in the status quo is it exists as like is it exist as a barrier, or is it exist like as a cushion for you? This looks like you're giving free hospitals, because when people are broke, they need to have a social safety net to be able to rely on to. When a life is struggling, you don't have to put yourself through like going to loan sharks or whatever. That limits your agency even further. And we say that when we have taxation, it's for the sake of social safety net, but simply volunteering is not the same. So when we already told you that this this does not fit any construct or justification that exists in the status quo. This is an illegitimate expansion of state power. And why is it so bad? Because my first speaker already told you that when the state has more power over your own agency, the state usually acts in a very utilitarian way. The problem with existing in a very utilitarian way is that when you consider utility, you don't care about people. You will be fine with sacrificing people just because of the collective might feel better. The same way here that you sacrifice some people's time and effort just for them to be able to help some other people. Before I move on, sure.
You say that we need to tax more because we need more money, but wouldn't that just create more resentment and pushback? Because taking away money from people's hard-earned salary is far more quantifiable and visual to that person than taking away time.
For most people who work for a living, time is money. And we say that time is a lot more important than money because it is something that actually matters for everyone. And on their side, it is incredibly harmful because imagine if you are a minimum wage worker who have many children or dependencies on you. Every single hour that you can work needs to be worked to be able to put food on the table for the people you love and the dependency that you care about. And we say that for these minorities, probably just loses government the debate. Why? Because simply these people will be sacrificed in the sense where their families living is just going to be sacrificed just for them to better the just for them to better the society. So we already told you that on side government, basically the whole policy is not an extension of what the state is doing, but it's an infringement of the rights that have been guaranteeing to normal people. So for all those reasons and for all the reasons given in the first speaker, that went unengaged, opposition.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the government whip to sum up government's case. Here.
The major problem of opposition's case is that they have failed to do their one simple burden of proving why this policy is practically problematic and why charities on their side of the house are less likely to be effective and less likely to be better than our side. They only focus on the idea of consent. If we are able to take down this idea of justification and consent, we take this debate so proud to propose. Two things in my speech. Firstly, onto my first issue on this debate about whether it's actually justified, which is their main push. Secondly, on the second issue in this debate on which side actually gets better charity work and which side is able to help these marginalized groups and these people in need at the end of the day. Now, firstly, on my first issue about whether it's actually justified in the very first place. So what did side of opposition tell us? They said that firstly, that consent is not present and that voting doesn't equal to the consent. The main idea in this entire clash is the idea of how we lack consent on our side of the house. We're forcing people to go do these voluntary work. We don't actually give them a choice. Firstly, we tell you if they want to argue consent in the very first place, they have to oppose every form of no consent. It's not just going to be about being compulsory voluntary work. It will look like having to abide by laws, having to go to military service in the future, or even having to not being able to consent to what kind of life you're living right now. They have to oppose every form of no consent. As long as they fail to do this, they can't take this clash. And what did we actually tell you on our side of the house? We told you that consent was never actually important in this debate. We argue on the justification of collective benefit and responsibility. We tell you that the benefits of this compulsory volunteer work is that people are able to reach out to these people in marginalized communities. We are able to reach out to these minority groups, and no thank you, and help these groups be able to uplift this group and in this society. We think that the idea of collective benefits do actually exist. We see many examples of this in the status quo right now. We see that, for example, mandatory education, where you have to complete this many years of primary schools and secondary education, it benefits us as an individual and benefits the society as a whole. And it's same for compulsory volunteer work at the same. No, thank you. In the same place, we tell you that compulsory voluntary work benefits you as an individual at the end of the day because you are learning these important soft skills by going out to these places and actually helping these and uplift these people, which help society as a whole and help these individuals who are in the most need. Next on, okay, if we argue on their very best case scenario on where we become utilitarianistic, as your second speaker said, we think that the benefit of the idea of collective benefits far outweighs all this idea. We're fine to bite the bullet and say that we become a utilitarianistic state, but at least the people and the quality of lives of individuals on the ground are being uplifted. We see that the poor are being able to live a higher quality of life. We see that people in rural and underprivileged areas are able to get the education they need. They're able to access the teachers and access, no thank you, the skilled teachers they need. We think that volunteer work does all that and it's extremely justified. Before I continue, I'll take your point.
If we force every doctor to work 100-hour work weeks for like no pay, you will probably have no one being sick in the country. Should we do that?
It won't look like having a doctor to work 100 hours a week. That's kind of extreme in the very first place because that takes up the majority of your week. We think that this more likely looks like simple volunteers, for example, high school students having to go out to these rural areas and carry out these outreach programs. It looks like people having to go clean up beaches or go out into these rural areas where they're unable to have actually qualified teachers or skilled teachers and able to teach these children in these schools. It doesn't look like forcing a doctor to spend the majority of their life working in this volunteer work the whole time. We don't think it's going to take so much of your life up. Next, onto the issue about which side gets better charity work. But firstly, before I go into this clash, I'd like to actually characterize and reframe what the actual problem is in this debate, since both sides have a different idea on what the problem is. Firstly, on what did our side tell you? We told you that the problem in this debate is actually the lack of personnel, the lack of people able to carry out this charity work. We think that in the status quo that many charities, for example, beach cleanup charities, lack the individuals able to go out to these beaches and actually clean up the trash. Or, for example, these education programs lack the individuals who are qualified enough to go out to these rural areas and actually teach these children effectively. We think that there's not enough volunteers in the very first place. That's why we need this compulsory volunteer work. So what did opposition tell us? They told you that we lack resources on their side of the house. In the status quo that these charities lack resources, they lack the proper infrastructure and expert capabilities to actually carry out this charity work effectively. So what is more likely on our side? What problem is more likely? We think that firstly, the majority of charities and these sustainability projects are actually ran by experts in the very first place. We don't think skill is an actual issue. We see that the majority of people here at this expo are indeed experts in their respective fields. We don't think skill is an actual problem. We think that it's more about the people on the ground, the people having to go out and do this hands-on work and charity work in the field. We think that's a real problem in this debate. We don't think it's actually about resources. Next, so what did they argue on their side of the house? They said that because of this idea of compulsory volunteering, people are going to believe that they have done enough. They think that they're satisfied with what they've done because they say, oh, I already worked for this many hours in doing voluntary work. I don't need to donate anymore. I did as much as I could. I did enough for society already. And they said that the impact of this is that these people won't donate as much. So the charities funding, the charities resources will be far less on our side of the house. Actually, but firstly, I would like to say that this is simply untrue. We think that because of this compulsory volunteer work, we think that people are able to become more politically aware, as my second speaker told you. We think that when people go out to these outreach areas, they go to these rural areas, they go to the disaster areas, they're likely to see the actual problem and actually be able to understand and see these problems firsthand and are more likely to empathize with these people, as we told you that these people have incentives to empathize with these people and actually want to help them in the very first place. It's just that they're unable to know the actual problems. They lack the information. And only when we are able to make them go out and do this charity work and actually work in these fields, we think that they're able to actually have more incentive to donate back to society and donate to these charities or go out and do this voluntary work even more. And secondly, I would like to completely flip this argument. They say that since people don't donate as much, because they've done enough work, you get less resources. But I think the main problem in the status quo is that the majority of resources in the status quo are being spent on hiring individuals to go carry out these charity work in the very first place. We see the majority of funds from these charities are being wasted on having to hire individuals to come in and put them on full-time contracts or full-time salaries in order to go and clean these beaches and go do these outreach programs. We think that the idea of compulsory voluntary completely fixes this. When you have people coming in because of this volunteering, they're basically free labor. They're able to help you do your tasks, and you are not needing to constantly hire new individuals. And it means that you will have even more resources to spend on other projects, more resources to improve the quality of your charity work. And at the end of the day, we think on this class, we simply take it. We think that we get better and more access to these charity work, to these people in the status quo. We think that these people in these rural areas, these people who are most in need, are able to access charity much more easier, and that people are more likely to donate, people are more likely to volunteer out of their own will and not just compulsory. This is why we're so proud to propose.
I thank the government whip for the speech. Next, I would like to invite the opposition whip to conclude today's debate. Here.
We see many problems and social issues in the status quo, and why government fails is that they think that these issues can be solved by simply having more people, when we've already told you since first how this is this problem-solution mismatch. I'll be explaining why in all of my 3 clashes. First of all, what does the status quo and the problem actually look like? Secondly, is on their side principally justified? And thirdly, even if it is, then why on their side they fail on practical impacts anyways? Rebuttals will be integrated into my clashes then. First of all, what does the status quo and the problem actually look like? Both sides agree here that the goal is to be helping more people or in achieving more change on global social issues. The PM has come up and said, and the problem in the status quo about how they don't have exposure and how people are selfish. But we see how that's not true when we see how people are already volunteering in the status quo. And there's stuff like college admissions or even like tax refunds where you get from volunteering, and that's why we see volunteers happening already in the status quo. But even if people are selfish, we still say that volunteer does in fact apply to that, because like for example, people wanting to volunteer because they want to look good, and we see that these are the people who are already volunteering and are able to benefit the volunteering stuff the most in the status quo. But the problem that actually can help social issues and changing, we think that it's actually government's infrastructures or helping vulnerable by using skills people, and these things need money, and these are just problems that more people can solve, because now when you put the money into having more people, like for example, like overseeing the whole program of volunteering, you lose money and you lose capital to be able to like build infrastructures and actually help these vulnerable people, right? And even if you help them, we think that on their side, they'll be helping mainstream issues, especially on their framing, how they're saying that, oh, you get to choose which volunteering that you actually want to do. And we think that that's probability of happening very high. While on our side, when the government has the more capital to put like money into resources and things that actually matter, leading to things that actually need help being helped and being saved. Okay. Going into my second clash then about principle, whether it's principally justified then. Okay, I'll take your point later. Government says it's justified because everyone has a social contract. But firstly, we say that in the status quo, that social contract is already flawed. But since this debate is about viewing and weighing down to volunteering, we say that volunteering is not justified, right? We say that because people, and this is especially important because even if the status quo, it has a social contract already, it's not perfect, but what on government side is trying to do is making that even worse, right? What they're doing is an illegitimate expansion of state power. So even if there's a social contract, it's just making this whole thing worse, right? But why it's actually worse for volunteering as its own thing, because volunteering doesn't fit into most of the social contract stuff in the status quo. Because in status quo, we give agency, like for example, you give state agency and it protects and helps you and your own agency. That's why we have taxes, like for example, social safety net when you can't do it or like for example war, if your country goes to war, it's going to be worse for you and less agency. But why volunteering doesn't fit into that? Because if you break it down, the obligation and the agency that you get in return is just not there. That's why it's not justified. And this is especially important because even if in the status quo, there's already a limit to agency all the time. That's why it matters even more to let people choose when they can and when they have the opportunity to choose, like for example in volunteering. And even if and to my LO's POI about how like doctors will like for example doctors having to work and not getting money to save hundreds of people, it's like this is just the beginning, right? If you're doing this, then you set a precedence that you're giving it your own stuff for the states better is okay, leading to situations like that being able to happen in the future because you already set a precedence for this, right? But okay, even if you say that it's not even if they are able to prove why it's justified, it actually leads to worse results anyways. And before I go into my last clash, I'll take a point.
What incentive does the government have to redistribute income when there's nobody to call them out like our side of the house?
Well, that's just not true because there's already people calling out stuff already, and we see that in the status quo. Just because you're volunteering doesn't literally mean that you're helping other people, not like you're like getting stuff or like calling out the government. Like that just doesn't make sense, right? Okay, so more on efficiency then of what actually gets better results and more people, especially to volunteers, right? The only thing government has been talking about is, oh, they get more people, but they've been going on psychologically instead of actually saying practical impacts that you get from having more people. Because first of all, their main push is about how people will like it more after a while, which we already proved that that's just not true, which we see in the status quo, like people literally, like kids having like military, like having to do, and they're not liking it anymore after they're doing it. But even if they do like it more, the impact is really low and doesn't matter anyways. When the status quo, there's already enough incentives for people to do so, right? But okay, even on government side, they get people to do it a little bit more. First of all, it actually why it's worse on their side, because first of all, it changes volunteering from something that you're doing, this is a good thing, to turning it to something that's a duty. Like for example, in the status quo, we have rich people doing a lot of volunteerings or donating because this is something that looks good. These things will become less because now that is something that, I'm doing this for the good of people, or that I'm a good person, turning it to a duty. These things will actually lessen down. But secondly, then, it creates an illusion of change, and the whole volunteering things becomes performative. It leads to people and even governments themselves thinking that, I'm already doing enough already. It looks like people saying, I don't have to help more other people because I'm already doing this volunteering. Or the government has less infrastructures or helping the vulnerable peoples because we're already putting people or having more people there. But why this is actually counterproductive then, because it lessens the quality of people. So even if there's more people, for example, people going to help elderlies, if you force someone to do it, it's probably likely possible that they're unlikely to care or give as much attention to when you're actually doing it, leading to, even if you have hundreds of people going to help, if they're actually sitting around or helping carrying stuff a little bit, the changes that comes is actually going to be very minor, right? And this is very counterproductive. And government can't co-opt this because the limited capacity to make volunteering compulsory, meaning that you have people to oversee, meaning that you have less capital to do other things. So even if on our side then we get less people, the resources are better located and we actually solve more problems, right? Is what will happen in our world then is that we use the money to build infrastructure or hire people with skills, and that actually helps the most. Because now instead of having 100 people who probably knows nothing and doesn't even care, we have, for example, 5 people who are professionals and are deeply involved into this and are deeply willing to help. And the impact that comes is that these people are able to create more change or more effective ways, leading to, even if you have less people, you need less people in the future then. So in their world, it's probably worse efficiency and actually harms the volunteer even more. But even if they're for example, having efficiency, it's actually not helping the most vulnerable people and going to more mainstream things. And on their side, they're just creating short-term health of having more people going to help, but actually doesn't achieve anything. While on our world, we get long-term impacts and long-term solutions to problems that in the status quo, we build infrastructures that can last for a very long time, and we actually pinpoint down to vulnerable peoples that need help in society and actually get them the help they need. Therefore, never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Another round of applause for the debaters today. ขอบคุณน้องๆทุกท่านนะครับสำหรับเนื้อหาที่เข้มข้นไปเลยวันนี้ สิ่งที่เราได้ฟังเมื่อสักครู่นะครับเป็นมากกว่าคำตอบตายตัวว่าเราควรทำให้ volunteering หรือจิตอาสาเนี่ยเป็นข้อบังคับในกฎหมายไหมเทียบกับภาษีเทียบกับการเป็นคณะลูกขุนในอเมริกานะครับมันเป็นมากกว่าคำตอบตายตัวตรงนี้เป็นมากกว่าผลแพ้ชนะของน้องๆในวันนี้แต่ว่ามันคือการชวนให้เราได้คิดต่อนะครับตั้งคำถามแล้วมองปัญหาจากหลายมุมครับไม่ว่าจะเป็นมุมว่าการที่เรามีจิตอาสาเนี่ยทำให้ภาษีคนจะไม่อยากจ่ายมากขึ้นหรือเปล่าหรือในเชิงสังคมและเชิงหลักการว่าเราทำจิตอาสาแล้วสังคมดีขึ้นก็เราก็ไม่ต้องให้รัฐบาลทำกฎหมายอะไรแล้วหรือเปล่านะครับสุดท้ายนี้นะครับถ้าทุกท่านสนใจร่วมสนับสนุน Thailand National Debate Team นะครับเรามีเสื้อของทีมนะครับที่ผมใส่อยู่อันนี้มีทั้งสีขาวและสีดำหรือว่าที่เห็นในรูปด้านบนเลยนะครับทุนรายได้ทั้งหมดตรงนี้เนี่ยเราจะนำไปสนับสนุนทำกิจกรรมต่างๆการซ้อมรวมถึงการนำทีมชาติไปแข่งเพื่อสร้างชื่อเสียงให้กับประเทศไทยต่อไปครับสามารถติดต่อด้านข้างเวทีได้ครับขอเสียงตบมือให้กับทีมชาติโต้สารวาทีภาษาอังกฤษแข่งประเทศไทยอีกหนึ่งรอบครับ
ขอเสียงปรบมือกับทุกท่านเลยเป็นกำลังใจให้นักโต้วาทีนะคะทีมชาติของเรา